For David, the graveyard shift as a security guard at the luxurious Blackwood Sons department store wasn't just a job, it was a mausoleum for his career. Once the celebrated artist of its famous window displays, a scandalous failure had cast him from the spotlight into the lonely, echoing darkness of the store at night. He was a ghost haunting the monument to his own past life. But in the vast, silent atrium, under the hum of the emergency lights, he was about to discover he wasn't the only ghost. The 6 hyper-realistic mannequins in the main display, his final, unfinished project, had started to move. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The silence of Blackwood Sons after midnight was a living thing. It was a dense, heavy presence that swallowed the sound of David's own footsteps on the polished marble floors. Each click of his heels echoed up into the vaulted ceilings of the main atrium, a lonely metronome counting down the 8 hours until sunrise. He hated this sound. It was the sound of his failure. Just a year ago, he had walked these same floors in Italian leather shoes, not scuffed security boots. He was David Heller, the Vitrini maestro, the artist whose window displays were local legends. Tourists took pictures, fashion blogs wrote articles. He didn't just dress mannequins, he curated dreams, freezing moments of impossible elegance behind panes of plate glass. He was the star of the store. His internal monologue, a bitter and constant companion on these long nights, replayed the catastrophe with perfect, torturous clarity. It was the Winter Gala display, his most ambitious project yet. Nocturne and crystal. A cascading spiral of glass snowflakes, antique mirrors, and 7 mannequins in silver gowns, seemingly floating midair. It was meant to be his masterpiece, but he had pushed the engineering too far, overruled the cautious advice of the structural team, blinded by his own vision. During the packed unveiling event, a critical support wire, overloaded by a few pounds of misplaced crystal, had snapped. The collapse was horrifically elegant, a slow, glittering implosion. No one was seriously injured, miraculously, but a shard of mirror had sliced the cheek of the CEO's wife, and the public humiliation was absolute. The maestro became the moron. He was fired the next day, his name a toxic asset. Desperate, drowning in debt and shame, he had crawled back a month later and taken the only position they'd offer, a man they couldn't stand to look at, but were perhaps too guilty to completely abandon. Overnight security. A janitor with a flashlight and a keycard. His rounds always ended at the same place, the main, street-facing window display. His window. It was currently a minimalist, chic scene titled Urban Asceticism. 6 mannequins, 3 male, 3 female, in severe, high-fashion beige and gray ensembles. The irony was gut-wrenching. He had sketched the initial concept for this very display on a napkin a week before his fall from grace. Now his former protégé, Maria, had executed it. Maria. He taught her everything, and now she was the head of visual merchandising. She walked the floors with the same confidence he once had, her heels clicking with purpose, not shame. Their interactions were brief and strained. She looked at him with a cocktail of pity and professional annoyance, as if his very presence was a sad, embarrassing reminder of a mess she had to clean up. He stood before the display, the cold glass separating him from his past. The mannequins were posed in what he called active stillness. A male mannequin held a leather briefcase, his body angled as if walking against a strong wind. A female mannequin, the lead, stood center stage. Her face was a mask of serene indifference, one hand resting delicately on her trench coat, her head tilted slightly to the left, gazing towards the empty street. It was a good pose, balanced, evocative. He would have tilted her head just a fraction more to create a stronger line with her shoulder, but it was a minor critique. He knew every line, every shadow, every nuance of this stage. He sighed, the condensation blooming and vanishing on the glass. Time for another round. He walked the perimeter of the store, his flashlight being kind through the oppressive darkness of the other departments. Menswear, with its headless torsos in silent, orderly rows. Cosmetics, a graveyard of shimmering dusts and perfumes hanging heavy in the air. Housewares, a maze of sterile, unused kitchens and bedrooms. The entire building felt like a city evacuated in a hurry. An hour later, he was back in the main atrium. He approached the window for a routine check. The streetlights outside cast long, distorted shadows into the store. He glanced at the 6 figures. And then he stopped. His heart gave a painful, sudden thud. The lead female mannequin. Her head. It was tilted at a different angle. A deeper angle. The one he had just been thinking about. The stronger line he would have created. He stepped closer, his face inches from the glass, his breath fogging it again. It was impossible. He was tired. The lights, the shadows, they played tricks. He'd seen it wrong the first time. He must have. He was the only one in the building. The doors were locked and alarmed. No one could get in or out. He stared for a full 5 minutes, trying to will the memory of the original pose back into his mind, to convince himself this was how it has always been. But a cold knot of certainty tightened in his stomach. It had changed. It was a tiny, infinitesimal detail, a detail only a window dresser, only he would ever notice. He dismissed it as a hallucination born of fatigue and regret. But as he turned to continue his rounds, he couldn't shake the chilling, impossible thought. Someone was in his window. The next night, David arrived for his shift armed with a new sense of paranoid purpose. The gnawing uncertainty had chewed at him all day, ruining his sleep, making him second-guess his own sanity. Tonight, there would be no ambiguity. There would be proof. Before starting his first round, he stood precisely where he had the night before and took out his phone. He opened the camera app, meticulously centering the main window display in the frame. He zoomed in slightly, ensuring every detail was crisp and clear. The lead mannequin's head was still at that new, improved angle. The other 5 figures were exactly as he remembered. He held his breath, tapped the screen, and the sharp, artificial sound of the camera shutter echoed unnervingly in the silent atrium. He now had a baseline, a control, a digital witness. He forced himself to follow his routine, to walk the designated path, to check the doors and monitors as he was paid to do. But his mind wasn't on fire exits or motion sensors. It was on the brightly lit stage at the front of the store. Every nerve ending felt hyper-aware, attuned to the cavernous space around him. The gentle hum of the HVAC system sounded like a low growl. The flicker of a distant streetlight seemed like a signal. He was a creature in a cage, and he felt as though the bars were watching him. The hours crawled by, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. At 3:15 a.m., after completing his third full circuit, he allowed himself to return to the main window. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the cathedral of silence. He approached the glass slowly, his eyes locked on the display. At first, everything looked the same. The 6 figures stood in their chic, frozen tableau. He felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made his knees buckle. It was him. He was losing his mind. The stress, the humiliation, it was finally cracking him. He let out a shaky breath, a dry, humorless laugh escaping his lips. Then he saw it. It wasn't the lead mannequin this time. It was one of the male figures to the far right, the one with the briefcase. In his photograph, the mannequin's left hand rested flat on its hip, thumb pointing forward, fingers aligned and straight in a classic, severe pose. Now, the hand was still on the hip, but it was raised by maybe a quarter of an inch. And the fingers were no longer straight. They were curled, slightly, as if impatiently tapping. The relief vanished, replaced by a surge of ice-cold adrenaline. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. He brought up the photograph, holding the screen next to the glass. He flicked his eyes back and forth. Photo, glass, photo, glass. There was no doubt. It wasn't a trick of light or shadow. It wasn't his imagination. The hand had moved. An inanimate object, sculpted from fiberglass and plaster, locked behind an alarmed glass partition in an empty, sealed building, had changed its pose. The immediate logical part of his brain, the part that had designed complex structural displays, seized on the only possible explanation. This wasn't supernatural, it was malicious. It was a prank, a cruel, targeted, and expertly executed prank. It had to be Maria. She and her team were the only ones who possessed the same intimate knowledge of posing as he did. They knew how to make a change so subtle it would be imperceptible to a normal security guard, but would scream out to him. They knew it would unnerve him, make him question his sanity. They resented him for being a constant, walking reminder of the store's biggest PR disaster. They must have a spare key, or know a way to bypass the alarms. They were sneaking in, making the change, and sneaking out, all to mess with the disgraced former maestro. The thought filled him with a hot, clarifying rage. Paranoia wrapped around him like a shroud. He wasn't just a guard, he was a target. He couldn't wait. He stalked the store for the rest of his shift, fury simmering in his veins. The moment his replacement arrived at 7 a.m., he didn't go home. He waited, loitering near the employee entrance until he saw Maria striding across the parking lot, coffee in hand. "Maria," he called out, his voice harsher than he intended. She stopped, her expression shifting from morning resolve to guarded annoyance. "David, something wrong?" "Don't play dumb with me," he said. "The game is over. It was a good one, I'll admit, very subtle, but I know it was you." Maria's brow furrowed. "What game? What are you talking about?" "The Mannequins," he hissed, his voice low and urgent. "Changing the poses every night, just a little bit, just enough for me to notice. You think that's funny, sneaking in here to make the crazy old guard feel even crazier?" She stared at him, her pity now completely eclipsed by offense. "Are you accusing me and my team of breaking into the store at night to move a mannequin's hand a quarter of an inch? Do you hear how you sound?" "I have proof. I have pictures," he shouted back, reaching for his phone. "Say it," she said, her voice sharp and final. She held up her own key card. "David, I'm the department head. I can see every time a door is opened, every alarm is deactivated. No one has entered or left this store during your shift since you started this job. Not once." She softened her tone slightly, the pity creeping back into her eyes, which was somehow worse. "Maybe you're more stressed than you think, David. It's a lonely shift. Stop staring at the windows and just watch the monitors. That's all you need to do." She turned and walked into the building, leaving him standing alone in the morning light, the rage draining out of him, replaced by a much deeper and more profound horror. The logs don't lie. No one came in. No one went out. But the mannequins were moving.
The logical, rational world David had been clinging to had crumbled. Maria's dismissal, backed by the cold, impartial data of the security logs, had eliminated the only sane explanation. What was left was the insane one, and the insanity was about to get personal. He began his next shift in a state of heightened dread. The store no longer felt merely empty, it felt poised, waiting. He avoided the main atrium for as long as he could, his rounds taking on a frantic, circuitous route. He knew he was only delaying the inevitable. The window was a stage, and he had the terrible feeling that a performance was scheduled for an audience of one. Finally, at 2 a.m., he forced his feet to carry him towards the main display. He rounded the corner and froze, the air leaving his lungs in a silent gasp. It wasn't a subtle shift anymore. The entire display had been rearranged. The 6 mannequins were now in a completely new tableau. A tableau of chaos, of failure. One of the male mannequins was no longer standing, but was posed on the floor, its back arched, head thrown back, one leg bent at an unnatural angle, as if it had just fallen from a great height. Another, a female figure, was leaning forward, her hand outstretched not in elegance but in alarm. But it was the central figure that made David's blood run cold. It was the lead mannequin, the first one that had moved. She was now posed to mimic the exact stance of the executive who had fired him. Feet planted wide, arms crossed, head tilted in an expression of condescending disappointment. It was his scandal. It was Nocturne in crystal, recreated in miniature, a sick parody sculpted from his own professional corpse. This was not a prank. A prank is meant to be shared, to be laughed about later. This was a targeted psychological scalpel designed to gut him from the inside out. No one else on Maria's team had been in that termination meeting. No one else knew the exact, humiliating posture of that executive. Only he would understand the devastating, layered significance of these specific poses. Only he could appreciate the cruel artistry. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his shock. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his mouth to stifle a cry. He turned and ran, not walked, to the security office. It was a small, windowless room in the basement, filled with the soft hum of servers and the glow of a dozen monitors. Safety. He sank into the worn chair, his body trembling. He had to see. He had to know how. He pulled up the archived footage from the camera pointed at the main window. His hands flew across the keyboard, fast-forwarding through the hours of tape. The timestamp in the corner of the screen blurred. 2100, 2200, 2300, 0001. On screen, the mannequins were perfectly still in their original urban asceticism poses. He slowed the footage down, advancing it frame by frame as the timestamp approached the moment he discovered the scene. Frame 15834, the original peaceful pose. Frame 15835, the original peaceful pose. Frame 15836, the tableau of his failure. There was no transition, no blur of movement, no shadowy figure sneaking into the frame. In the space between one frame and the next, in a sliver of time too small for the camera to capture, 6 large, heavy, inanimate objects had been completely and silently rearranged into a sculpture of his deepest regret. They didn't move on camera. They simply were moved. He rewound and replayed the footage a dozen times, a sick, obsessive rhythm. Still frame, new frame. Still frame, new frame. It was a glitch in reality, a tear in the fabric of physics. He felt a profound sense of violation, as if something had reached directly into his head, plucked out his most traumatic memory, and given it form. He leaned back, the cheap office chair groaning under his weight. He looked at the bank of monitors, showing the empty, silent hallways of the store. But they didn't feel empty anymore. He got the chilling, unshakable feeling that he wasn't the only one watching. The mannequins were not just moving, they were performing. They were performing for an unseen audience, using his memories as their script. And tonight, he was the only one in the theater.
The nightly assaults on David's sanity grew more invasive, more cruelly intimate. The entity, he was sure it was an entity now, was no longer content to simply replay his professional failures. It began to dig deeper, excavating the buried ruins of his personal life. One night, he arrived to find the mannequins posed in a scene of venomous, silent argument. A male and female figure stood apart, their fiberglass bodies crackling with tension. The male's hand was raised, fingers splayed, not in violence, but in a gesture of frantic, desperate explanation. The female's head was turned away, her posture a sculpture of rigid, unforgiving rejection. It was a perfect, heartbreaking mimicry of the final fight he'd had with his ex-wife, Sarah, the night she'd packed her bags and left. The pose was so accurate, he could almost hear their shouted words echoing in the vast empty space. He had to retreat to the security office for an hour, his breath catching in painful sobs. Another night, the display was even more disturbing. The 6 mannequins were arranged around a single, smaller, child-sized mannequin he had never seen before, one that must have been dragged up from storage in the basement. The small figure stood alone in the center, while the larger ones loomed over it, their blank faces angled down, their bodies forming a claustrophobic circle. It was a scene from his own childhood, a recurring nightmare he'd never spoken of to anyone. The feeling of being the small, strange new kid at school, surrounded by staring, judging faces. The sheer specificity was terrifying. These weren't generic scenes of sadness, they were his. They were moments sealed away in the vaults of his own mind. Huddled in the sterile light of the security office, surrounded by the silent watching eyes of the camera feeds, David began to form a theory. This wasn't a ghost. Ghosts were echoes of people, tied to a place by death or tragedy. This felt different. It was something more primal, more abstract. He started calling it the pose thief, the echo artist. His theory was this: the entity was a form of psychic parasite, drawn not to death, but to places of intense, focused creative energy and public observation. A theater stage, a gallery, or, in this case, a department store window. A place designed to be a spectacle, to be watched by thousands. It had no form of its own, no voice. It was an aesthetic being. It communicated, it manifested, it fed by shaping the inanimate world into reflections of the observer's strongest emotional memories. The more intense the emotion, the regret, the fear, the sorrow, the more real its creations became. It was feeding on his emotional reaction. His pain was its sustenance. As his theory took shape, he started noticing other, smaller physical signs that he'd previously dismissed. The air in the atrium, specifically near the window display, was always colder than the rest of the store, a pocket of unnatural chill that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Sometimes, when the store was at its most silent, he would hear faint whispering sounds that he had thought were the vents, but now sounded distinctly like the rustle of fine silk or stiff taffeta, even when the mannequins were dressed in wool. The most concrete evidence came one morning, just as the sun was beginning to dilute the darkness outside. As he did one last fearful pass by the window, he noticed a fine, shimmering powder on the dark marble floor just inside the glass partition. He knelt down, his fingers brushing against the dust. It was gritty, like fine sand, with a chalky texture. He looked at his fingertips. It was the color of plaster, of fiberglass. It was the dust of the mannequins themselves, as if the act of being rearranged each night was causing them to shed microscopic particles of their own bodies. The echo artist was not just moving them, it was physically consuming them to create its art.
David's mission changed. He was no longer just a passive, terrified observer. He became a hunter. His new obsession was to catch the entity in the act, to witness the moment of transformation. The security cameras had failed him, showing only the impossible jump from one state to another. He would have to use his own eyes. He dragged a tall stool from the cosmetics counter and placed it in the center of the atrium, directly in front of the main display. There, he sat for hours, forcing himself into a state of unwavering vigilance. He propped his chin on his hands, his gaze locked on the 6 silent figures. He refused to blink, his eyes burning, tears streaming down his cheeks from the strain. He ignored the calls from his pager, the flashing lights on the security console. There was only the window. For 3 hours, nothing happened. The mannequins stood in their cruel tableau of the day, a recreation of his father's funeral. Then a sudden beep from his pocket, a low battery warning on his phone. An involuntary split-second reflex. His eyes darted down to the phone in his hand. It took less than a second. He looked back up. The male mannequin representing his uncle had moved. Its arm, previously hanging limp at its side, was now raised, the hand resting on the shoulder of the mannequin next to it in a gesture of false comfort he remembered with sickening clarity. It had happened in the blink of an eye. The sheer speed and utter silence of the change were more terrifying than if they had moved with groans and screeches. It was a fundamental violation of the laws of motion. It suggested a power that didn't need to obey the rules of the physical world.
He felt a wave of nausea. He hadn't just been outsmarted, he had been toyed with. The horror deepened later in the week. He was standing close to the glass, his breath fogging the surface, studying the intricate details of a pose he didn't recognize, a woman looking at a handheld mirror that wasn't there. He was tired, defeated. He saw his own haggard reflection superimposed over the scene, a ghost in the machine. He turned his head to the right to look down the long, dark corridor towards the escalators. And in the glass, the reflection of one of the mannequins behind him, a male figure standing in the back, also turned its head. It did not move in the real world. He would have heard it, seen it in his peripheral vision. But in the world of the reflection, its smooth, featureless face rotated slowly, silently, tracking his movement. It watched him go. David froze, his blood turning to ice. He slowly, so slowly, turned back towards the window. The mannequin was back in its original position, staring straight ahead. Its reflection was also back to normal, static and lifeless. Had he imagined it? Was his mind now manufacturing horrors even where there were none? The next morning, Maria came in early to prepare for a visit from corporate. She found David on the stool, pale and unshaven, staring catatonically at the display. She followed his gaze. The mannequins were no longer in any recognizable commercial pose. They were a bizarre, unsettling tangle of limbs. Two were crouched on the floor, facing a corner. One was upside down, balanced impossibly on its head. It was avant-garde, disturbing, and completely unsellable. It looked like madness given form. "David, what is this?" she asked, her voice tight with alarm. "Did you do this?" David didn't even look at her. "They're performing," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "They're performing for me." Maria looked from the deranged display to David's terrifyingly vacant expression. She knew her team hadn't done this. She knew David, even in his current state, didn't have the key to get inside the display. For the first time, looking at the impossible, grotesque arrangement and the broken man in front of it, she didn't feel pity or annoyance. She felt a flicker of genuine, primal fear. She backed away slowly, hiding it behind a mask of authority she didn't feel. I'll have my team fix this immediately." A new kind of clarity began to cut through David's fear. It was the clarity of a cornered animal, the desperate lucidity that comes when all other options have been exhausted. He understood the entity's nature, its methods, its food source. It was an artist, and he was its sole muse, its unwilling collaborator. If the echo artist was feeding on the emotional energy generated by his memories, then perhaps, just perhaps, he could change the menu. That night, instead of watching the window, he sat in the security office with the door locked. He put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones and turned on his phone. He deliberately avoided his own thoughts, his own history. Instead, he sought out the stories of others. He listened to a long-form true crime podcast, a grim, detailed account of a famous local bank robbery from the 1970s that had ended in a tragic standoff. He immersed himself in the narrator's descriptions of the masked robbers, the terrified hostages on the floor, the determined police chief outside. He forced himself to visualize every detail, to feel the manufactured tension of the story. He followed that with an online article, a poignant, heartbreaking story about a family that had lost their home in a fire, complete with photographs of the charred ruins and the family members embracing, their faces etched with loss and shock. He studied their poses, their expressions of grief, flooding his mind with an emotion that was powerful, but crucially, not his own. He spent hours doing this, force-feeding his psyche a diet of secondhand tragedy. He was weaponizing empathy, turning his mind into a broadcast antenna for other people's pain. Around 4 a.m., trembling with a mixture of hope and terror, he unlocked the office door and walked to the atrium. He kept his eyes on the floor until he was directly in front of the window, then slowly raised his head. It had worked. The mannequins were in a brand new pose. It had nothing to do with his life. 3 of the mannequins were crouched low to the ground, their hands behind their backs, heads bowed. They were the hostages. 2 others stood over them, their bodies angled aggressively, holding imaginary rifles. The robbers. The final mannequin stood slightly apart, one hand held up to its face as if shielding its eyes from a harsh light, a perfect echo of a photo he had just seen of the police chief at the scene. A wave of chilling, triumphant validation washed over David. It was the terrifying joy of a scientist whose most monstrous hypothesis has just been proven correct. He was not insane. The entity was real, and he understood its rules. It was a psychic sponge, an empty canvas that absorbed the most vivid images in the nearest conscious mind, and he was its only source of inspiration. And with that confirmation came a new, even more terrifying idea. What happens if he gives it nothing? The entity fed on emotionally charged images. It needed a script, a memory to perform. What would happen if the stage was set, the audience was present, but the script was blank? What would happen if he could quiet his mind, block all memories, all emotions, and present the echo artist with a perfect, empty, silent canvas? Would it starve? Would it lose its anchor to this place and simply dissipate? Or, he thought with a jolt of pure dread, would it do something far, far worse to provoke a reaction?
This was the end game. David knew he couldn't outrun the entity, and he couldn't endure its psychological torture indefinitely. His only chance was to seize control of the performance. His plan was simple in concept, but monumentally difficult in execution. He would make himself the most boring audience in the world. He didn't hide in the security office. He walked to the center of the atrium, placed the stool in its now familiar spot directly in front of the window, and sat. He was in full view, a solitary spectator in a grand, dark theater. Then he closed his eyes and began the process of emptying his mind. He drew on techniques he'd read about but never practiced, from a life he'd lived before the fall, articles on mindfulness for stressed executives. He focused first on his breath, the simple, mechanical rhythm of air entering and leaving his lungs. Inhale, exhale. When a thought surfaced, the memory of the collapsed display, the sting of Maria's pity, the curve of his ex-wife's smile, he didn't fight it. He acknowledged it, labeled it as simply a thought, and let it drift away, returning his focus to the anchor of his own breathing. He made himself a blank slate. He was not David Heller, the failed artist or the humiliated guard. He was just a man, in a room, breathing. He pushed away fear, regret, hope, and even his own theory about the entity. He became nothing, an empty vessel. For a long time, nothing happened. The silence in the atrium felt different now, not just empty, but expectant. He could feel the entity's attention on him, a palpable but unseen pressure against his consciousness. It was searching, probing for an image, a memory, a flicker of emotion to latch onto, to sculpt. And it was finding nothing. Then the reaction began. It was not a release, but a desperate escalation. A sound, a low, grinding noise, like stone on stone. It was coming from the window. Against every instinct, David kept his eyes closed, his focus locked on his breath. But he could hear it, a slow, jerky scrah, then another. The sound of cracking plaster, the twitching groan of a limb being forced to move. Starved of his memories, the entity was trying to generate its own material. It was forgoing the subtlety of the frame-to-frame jump and resorting to raw, physical animation. The mannequins were moving, not between moments, but within them. Their limbs were twitching, their heads turning with agonizing slowness. They were no longer recreating the past. They were putting on a horror show in the present, trying to get his attention, to provoke the one emotion they had left to feast on, pure terror. David's heart hammered, but he held fast, his meditation becoming a shield. He would not give it the satisfaction. When the overtures of fear failed to break his concentration, the mannequins did something new, something far more insidious. The frantic, jerky movements stopped. The scraping and cracking fell silent. A new, profound stillness settled over the display. David, deep in his meditative state, felt a shift in the psychic pressure. It was no longer a frantic probing. It was coalescing, focusing. Slowly, one by one, the 6 mannequins began to move with a new, terrifying grace. They stopped their chaotic dance and turned their heads. They adjusted their torsos, their arms, their legs. They were arranging their bodies to point directly at him. Then, in perfect, unison silence, they began to slowly, deliberately mimic his own meditative pose. Legs crossed, back straight, hands resting on their knees. They copied his stillness. They were imitating him. It was the entity's final horrifying gambit. It was an act of ultimate imitation, an attempt to synchronize with him, to possess his present moment since it could no longer access his past. David felt a cold psychic pull from the window, a silent, seductive invitation to join them. To let go of the struggle, to release his consciousness and become one with their empty, static, perfect stillness. The echo artist was trying to steal not just his memories, but his very self.
The psychic pull was a siren song for the exhausted. It promised an end to fear, to regret, to struggle. It offered the profound peace of utter emptiness. For a terrifying second, David felt himself yielding, his consciousness fraying at the edges, tempted by the allure of becoming a perfectly still, unfeeling thing behind the glass. He realized this was the entity's endgame. If it couldn't feed on his past, it would consume his present, trapping him in a state of living stillness, making him a permanent part of its collection. He had to break the connection. He had to ruin the performance. With a surge of defiant adrenaline, David opened his eyes. The sight before him was of 6 perfect plaster and fiberglass mirrors, 6 mannequins posed in perfect meditative stillness, all aimed directly at him. The psychic pull intensified, a vortex threatening to draw him in. But seeing it with his own eyes gave him the anchor he needed. This was his stage. He had built his life on stages like this. He stood up from the stool, breaking his pose. The moment he did, the 6 mannequins froze, their mimicry now broken. He walked with renewed purpose, not away from the window, but towards the small, unmarked access door at the side of the display that was always kept locked. He pulled the master key from his belt, the one he was only supposed to use in an emergency, and jammed it into the lock. It turned with a loud click that echoed like a gunshot. He stepped inside, into the brightly lit world of the display. He was among them. They loomed over him, silent and accusatory, their blank faces pointing to the stool where he had just been sitting. The air was unnaturally cold, thick with a strange static energy. He was no longer the audience. He was the director. In a desperate, brilliant act of reclaiming his own art form, he reached out and grabbed the nearest mannequin. The fiberglass was cold and unnervingly dense. He wrestled with its stiff limbs, breaking its meditative pose. He turned it away from the center, angling its head towards the street outside, its arms arranged as if shielding its eyes to see a distant dawn. He was overriding their script with his own. He moved to the next one and the next. He worked with a frantic, creative energy he hadn't felt in years. He broke their accusatory circle. He moved a male and female figure together, their hands almost touching, in a pose not of argument but of gentle reconciliation. He took the mannequin that had been posed as if it were falling and set it upright, its arms raised in a gesture triumph. He was no longer reenacting trauma. He was sculpting hope. Finally, he came to the last one, the lead mannequin, the first to have moved. He grabbed its shoulders and turned it to face the back of the display, towards the interior of the store. He bent its leg, lifted its arm, and arranged it into the pose of a person taking a determined step forward, as if walking out of the display and into a new life. As he moved its foot over the threshold of the display's boundary, he felt it, a psychic snap, a sudden jarring release, like a string pulled taut for too long had finally broken. The intense, oppressive cold in the display vanished instantly, replaced by the normal ambient temperature of the store. The feeling of being watched, of being probed and performed for, evaporated. The air felt light, normal. The entity, its canvas co-opted, its ultimate performance ruined by the very artist it sought to consume, had lost its anchor. It was gone. David stumbled out of the display, breathing heavily, and sank onto the stool, his legs giving out. He sat there for the rest of his shift, watching the beautiful, unauthorized, and deeply personal display he had created. When Maria arrived, she found him sitting quietly in the atrium, looking at his work. She saw the new tableau, one of hope, of movement, of looking forward. She saw the look of profound, exhausted peace on David's face. For the first time, she didn't see a ghost of failure. She saw an artist. She looked at the display, then back at him, and simply nodded. She didn't ask any questions. The next day, David quietly resigned from his security job. The final frame. Months later, the city lights of another town glinted off the windows of a small, prestigious art gallery. Inside, David was consulting on a new installation, his hands confidently adjusting a sculpture, his voice clear and steady as he gave directions. His confidence was restored, his talent finding a new home. That night, walking back to his apartment, his path took him past the brightly lit window of a high-end clothing boutique. He paused for a moment, looking at the cheerful, commercial display. The mannequins were bright, stylish, and perfectly, reassuringly still. He smiled faintly and turned to walk away. As he did, he glanced at his own reflection in the dark plate glass. For a split second, his reflection didn't move. It seemed to freeze, holding its pose a moment too long, a dark figure of perfect stillness watching him go, before it caught up with him and disappeared into the night. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.